Hello viewers, this is the Krasmodo channel. What makes the much respected Kawasaki H2R motorcycle so remarkable? The H2R has enormous engine power. Its 1-liter power unit delivers a maximum of 326 horsepower. This allows the motorcycle to exceed 400 kilometers per hour. Crazy numbers, right? And thanks to what? That's right, turbocharging. Increasing the air pressure at the intake allows you to increase the amount of fuel supplied and accordingly the power produced per unit of engine volume per unit of volume. A supercharger or compressor is classified by drive method into turbochargers, mechanical superchargers, and electric superchargers. In one of the episodes, the title of which starts with a couple of words, I talked about turbocharging and its use on motorcycles. If you haven't seen the turbo episode, I highly recommend it. And in that same video, I promised that in a separate episode, we would take a look at the mechanical supercharger and its use on motorcycles. And believe me, this topic is much broader than it might seem at first glance. Let's talk about supercharged motorcycles. Get comfortable. This will be interesting. So, a bit of theory. Mechanical supercharging is one of the devices capable of increasing engine power. A mechanical blower, also known as a supercharger or compressor, is a device that draws in atmospheric air through a filter, compresses it, and delivers it to the engine's intake system. Compressors are classified by boosting principle into positive displacement and dynamic types. Positive displacement blowers deliver boost in pulses of a set volume. Among these designs, there are lobe type, by American companies Roots and Eaton, screw type, by American Lysholm and German Mercedes, scroll type, by German G-Lader and vane type, such as the British Power Plus blower for pre-war Morris garages and the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Dynamic blowers provide boost with a continuous flow. Driven dynamic blowers are known only in the centrifugal type. This type of blower uses an impeller similar to the compressor impeller in a turbocharger. Like any design, a mechanical blower has both advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage of a supercharger is that, unlike a turbocharger, it can pump air without any delay. The boost pressure increases directly with engine speed. Another advantage is the lower cost compared to a turbo and the simpler installation on the engine. Also, with less thermal stress, material and lubrication requirements for the components are lower than for a turbocharger. The main disadvantage of a mechanical supercharger is that it takes some of the engine's power for its own needs, and sometimes this figure can reach up to 30%. The history of supercharging is quite interesting, and its roots go back to the mid-19th century. The first so-called blowers weren't originally made for engines. There is information that in 1849, a certain George Jones from Birmingham, England, began producing a vane pump for ventilating coal mines. Other pioneers in this field include American brothers Roots, Philander, and Francis, who worked in engineering, a profitable field during the Industrial Revolution. In 1854, these two founded the Roots Blower Company in Connersville, Indiana. The enterprise was built near the Whitewater Canal, where a 3.35-meter height difference powered a water wheel. The torque from this wheel was distributed to the factory's machines. At a certain point, the power of this very wheel was no longer sufficient. To solve the problem, the brothers built a water wheel with a very interesting blade profile, which in theory promised an increase in power. However, since the blades were made of wood, they swelled and jammed. During the inspection of the unit, while spinning the blades dry, the airflow blew off one of the brothers' hats. At that moment, a certain owner of a steel business was hanging out with the brothers, and noticing this, he told the Roots brothers that such a blower would be useful in his industry, and that's when it all started. In 1860, the brothers patented a design for a pump to supply air to blast furnaces. And in 1875, they started producing similar pumps for mine ventilation. Later on, Roots blowers would find their use in internal combustion engines, and their name would become a household term. In March 1878, the German engineer Heinrich Krieger received the first patent for a screw compressor. The design was a two-lobed rotary unit with rotors of the same shape. However, the design never went into production. In the same year, 1878, the Scottish engineer Dugald Clerk designed the first supercharger that was used with an engine. This compressor was installed on a two-stroke gas engine. Early internal combustion engine designers realized that pre-compressing the fuel-air mixture before it enters the cylinders could boost power without increasing engine size. At the origins of supercharging stood Gottlieb Daimler, who, back in 1885, received patent DRP 34926 for an engine supercharging system with forced ignition. The attempt to implement the patent in metal was unsuccessful. The power increase was minimal, and the technical implementation was complex. Rudolf Diesel also proposed pre-compressing air at the engine intake. In 1896, he used supercharging on his engine's second prototype. Until World War I, supercharging engines advanced cautiously. In 1905, Alfred Bucci, in some sources Bucci, received a patent for the design of a turbocharger. Aviation, propelled by World War I, made a major contribution to supercharging development through its rapid progress. During this war, it became clear that the airplane could be a formidable weapon as well as an effective means of reconnaissance. An arms race began. Airplanes became more powerful, faster, and more efficient. There is one nuance for piston aviation. When reaching an altitude of 5,000 meters above sea level, the thinner atmosphere reduces the amount of air filling the cylinders. As a result, engine power drops by about half. Supercharging proved to be the solution that addressed this problem and boosted aviation altitude performance. Also, low temperatures at high altitudes somewhat reduced the main drawbacks of early supercharger designs. The first aircraft engine with a mechanical supercharger was the two-stroke rotary engine of Mayuri Viliata. At 5,200 meters, its supercharged performance matched that at sea level. How does it usually happen? Aircraft engine manufacturers sometimes also develop engines for cars and motorcycles. And if they don't, they communicate with other engine builders. In general, supercharging technology soon made its way into automobile and motorcycle manufacturing. As early as 1923, Whiting-designed mechanical superchargers were installed on Fiat and Mercedes racing cars. And here, as usual, the situation develops. Someone was the first to install the wonder weapon on a racing car and won. And immediately, if the conditions and the rules of the game allow, other firms and companies start thinking, wait a minute, what are they doing? Are we any worse? We'll make the same thing, but even better, and beat those upstarts. These are roughly the kinds of thoughts that happen during any technological arms race. In the 1920s, mechanical supercharging made its way to motorcycles. Or, to put it more accurately, motorcycle manufacturers started using this technology. And in this context, what is the right thing to do? That's right. It is necessary to design a high-performance racing motorcycle that will outshine its competitors, and at the same time promote the company itself. The world's first motorcycle with a mechanical supercharger appeared in 1925. By the mid-1930s, almost every respectable motorcycle company was at least experimenting with supercharging. A.J. Stevens and Kona Leotid Velichetti, BMW, Bro Superior, Dampfkraftwagen, NSU, Moto Guzzi, Gelira, and so on. This was the true golden age of the supercharger, which lasted until the early 1950s. However, let's take it step by step. 1925. In the field of mechanical supercharging on motorcycles, the Germans from Victoria Werke succeeded. The engineer from this company, Gustav Steinlein, created this motorcycle for racing and records. The foundation was the Victoria KR3, featuring a 500cc overhead valve boxer engine mounted transversely in the frame. A Roots-type supercharger was installed on the engine, and in the first attempt to set a speed record for the kilometer in 1925, the Victoria motorcycle reached a speed of 146 kilometers per hour. After modifications in 1926, racer Adolf Brudes took the motorcycle back to the Freiburg track, reaching 166 kilometers per hour. This was a new absolute speed record for motorcycles in Germany. The machine was not without its flaws. For example, due to the increased power from the supercharger, the rear cylinder started to overheat. Victoria Werke quickly stopped developing supercharged motorcycles, while Rudolf Schleicher started building superchargers at BMW. It's possible that there was some kind of agreement between Victoria and BMW. There is information that one of the early supercharged motorcycles was a machine with a JAB engine built by Michael McAvoy from McAvoy Motorcycles in 1926. However, I have found no confirmation of this. It was likely a highly tuned large V-twin, enabling the motorcycle to reach 180-190 km/h and set several records. The first BMW motorcycle with a supercharger was the racing model WR750 introduced in 1929. The idea to equip the opposed two-cylinder engine with a supercharger came from the designer of the BMW R37 racing motorcycle, Rudolf Schleicher. He was working as a designer in this direction, but left BMW before the first working prototype was created. He handed over all his developments to the racing mechanic Josef Hopf, as well as to the BMW factory racer and German champion of 1926-1927, Ernst Jakob Henne. These two managed to bring the project to completion. The first BMW engines with supercharging were tested on the test bench in 1928, and a year later, the WR750 motorcycle was ready. A blade-type supercharger designed by Arnold Zoller was installed above the gearbox, which, depending on the tasks and goals, could boost the engine pressure up to 2 bar. A bit about Zoller. Arnold, a Swiss by nationality, was born in 1882. He trained as a mechanic at Gebrüder Sulzer AG, and in 1906 he received a diploma as a mechanical engineer from the Technical Center in the Swiss city of Winterthur. Even before the start of World War I, Arnold received several patents for supercharger designs. Later, he worked in this field at Argus, Motorengesellschaft, Horch, and Ruhr Auto AG. Superchargers designed by Zoller would be used by companies such as BMW, NSU Dampfkraftwagen, and others. Zoller made significant contributions to supercharged motorcycles, and his name will appear several times in this story. Let's get back to BMW VR750. The supercharger was first powered by a chain from the engine's crankshaft, but over several years, both its design and drive type changed slightly. In 1929, Ernst Henne set a record average speed of 216.75 kilometers per hour on the VR750 in the Flying Mile Run. Until the mid-30s, this motorcycle actively participated in record runs, competing with British motorcycles such as Zenith, Osborne Engineering Company, and Bro Superior. These four were actively competing for the title of the fastest motorcycle throughout the 30s. From 1929 to 1935, BMW set 5 absolute records, which means the British trio broke the record 4 times. In 1935, the VR750 reached a speed of 255.885 kilometers per hour. However, as usually happens in races and record runs, even the most successful and high-performance machines can't stay at the top in this niche for a long period. Competitors will create something more powerful, faster, and efficient. In 1936, BMW rolled out a new supercharged motorcycle. The model was called Type 255. In different sources, you can find the names RS 255, RS 500, and VR 500. The engine, still with BMW's typical layout, was reduced in displacement to 492 cubic centimeters, but it was even more powerful than the VR 750. The cylinder heads received 2 overhead camshafts and 4 valves per cylinder. The same Zoller was still responsible for the supercharging. At first, the engine's power was about 60 horsepower, but by 1939, it was increased to 68. The motorcycle could reach 225 kilometers per hour and had a curb weight of 137 kilograms. For the top 500cc atmospheric bike then, the single-cylinder Norton, these specs were 50 horsepower, 200 km/h, and 140 kilograms. On November 28, 1937, Ernst Henne put a decisive end to the competition with the British for the maximum speed record. The 500cc Supercharged BMW had a fairing, and higher boost increased engine power to 108 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. And on a closed Autobahn for the run, Henne showed an average maximum speed of 279.503 kilometers per hour on the round trip. This record would last 14 years until 1951. BMW scored another major victory with the RS 255E's participation in the Tourist Trophy race on the Isle of Man. In 1938, 3 BMWs went to the island, 2 of which dropped out of the race and 1 finished in 5th place. But already in 1939, Georg Meyer won there. It was the first victory by a non-British participant in the top class, the 500cc Senior Tourist Trophy. In the golden era of the Supercharger, the Germans were the most successful in building supercharged motorcycles, and there were several reasons for this fact. Germany was among the world's most technologically advanced countries, then, with many innovative designs emerging there. As you know, racing and record attempts are first and foremost a huge financial investment, which doesn't necessarily guarantee a place on the podium. So, in addition to the strong technological aspect, the development of racing cars and motorcycles in Germany in the 1930s was also influenced by political factors. With the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazis, sports became extremely politicized. German athletes, through their victories, were supposed to demonstrate the superiority of the nation and the established political system, thereby attracting supporters. Auto and motorsports were given tremendous importance in this project. Significant amounts of money were allocated for the development of sports equipment. The lion's share ended up in the accounts of the Daimler-Benz and Auto Union corporations. It was with this money that the famous Silver Arrows were created. But motorcycle companies also received a sufficient amount of funds. And BMW was not the only brand that succeeded in building supercharged motorcycles. Another German company, Dampfkraftwagen, was also prepared to carry out the party's assignment. Dampfkraftwagen later built the most supercharged motorcycles in history. Why? It's simple. In the early 1930s, it was the world's largest motorcycle company, employing 20,000 people. Dampfkraftwagen had it all: technology, talented engineers, production and testing facilities, and money. The specialists at this company began working on supercharged engines back in the late 1920s, but these engines were built using a completely different design compared to BMW or Victoria. First, the engines were two-stroke. Second, they had U-shaped cylinders with 2 pistons per cylinder. Third, they were liquid-cooled. And fourth, they used piston compressors. The last fact is especially noteworthy because these remarkable engines were developed by Arnold Zoller, the inventor of the eponymous vane compressor. And the preference for a piston compressor is easy to explain. It delivers pressure exactly when it's needed during the intake phase. German engineers tried countless different options: compressor in the crankcase or a separate cylinder driven directly by the crankshaft or via a gear transmission, with the fuel mixture entering the compressor through reed valves and through a cylindrical slide valve. The Gorelli design with U-shaped cylinders was not chosen by accident. It was not possible to use supercharging in a classic 2-stroke engine layout. The fuel-air mixture would simply be blown out into the exhaust system. The first Dampfkraftwagen motorcycles with supercharging using a piston compressor were built in 1929 by Hugo Ruppe. There were 2 models, a 173cc one with 12 horsepower and a 250cc one with 17 horsepower. In these images, you can see the engine diagram. In the mid-1930s, 500 and 600 cc Zoller engines with superchargers appeared. In the late 1930s, Arnold drastically shifted supercharged Dampfkraft wagon development by adopting a centrifugal supercharger design. In October 1937, Dampfkraft wagon prepared several modified URE twins running on methanol to set speed records. Ivo Kluge and his teammate Walfrid Winkler rode carefully tuned machines. The 250 produced 49 horsepower and the 350 about 60. The motorcycles used special fairings to improve their aerodynamic characteristics. Speed runs were held on a section of the Autobahn between Frankfurt and Darmstadt, where 14 speed records were set. A huge number of victories were achieved on the supercharged Dampfkraft wagon motorcycles. The most prominent and significant among them was the Tourist Trophy race in the 250cc class, won by Ewald Klug in 1938 on the Isle of Man. Not even the extreme fuel consumption stopped Klug from winning. The engine used around 16 liters per 100 kilometers during the race. Klug won 12 out of 14 races he participated in during 1938, taking second place in the remaining 2, which made him the European champion in the 250cc class. At the end of the season, he earned the title Champion of Champions, a prize awarded only to riders who scored the maximum possible points in European competitions. The pinnacle of Dampfkraftwagen's engineering was this motorcycle. Its opposed two-stroke engine has 4 pistons moving toward each other in 2 cylinders. The development of this unique machine began in 1936. The design turned out to be interesting and promising. Engine displacements of 250, 350, and 500 cc were planned, but Dampfkraftwagen already had high-performing supercharged race motorcycles. The project was put on the back burner, and then the war started, so racing was no longer a priority. In 1945, the Dampfkraftwagen factory in Zschopau ended up in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviet administration learned about this development and considered it appropriate to complete the project in order to send some of the equipment and documentation to the Serpukhov Motorcycle Design Bureau for use in racing and record attempts. In 1945, a Special Design and Technical Bureau No. 10 was established based on the Dampfkraftwagen facilities, where leading engineers were brought together. They were tasked with building a motorcycle. Between 1946 and 1948, 4 350cc units and 1 250cc unit were produced with power outputs of 60 and 45 horsepower, respectively. In Germany, after the dissolution of SKTB-10, the German racer Kurt Kuhnke became interested in this design and, hiring several Dampfkraftwagen engineers, built a 250 cubic centimeter racing machine. Other information states that one built engine was concealed from the Soviet administration and sent to West Germany. Kurt competed on this motorcycle in 1950 and 1951. The machine has survived to this day. We will talk about the Dampfkraftwagen compressor technologies that ended up in the Soviet Union in a separate chapter. So, the third German company to design a supercharged motorcycle was NSU. Later than the others, NSU specialists developed a racing motorcycle with a supercharger. This happened in 1938. The motorcycle, built by Albert Roeder, was equipped with a 2-cylinder overhead valve engine with a displacement of 350 cubic centimeters, which produced about 50 horsepower. NSU participated in the 1939 Tourist Trophy, but they didn't achieve a remarkable victory. The motorcycle's design was crude and unreliable, and its weight of 155 kilograms was excessive. NSU would recall these developments only after the war. In 1948, a modified 350 with a supercharger began to compete in races, and by 1949, a similar 500 cubic centimeter machine was ready for racing. Its inline twin produced 85 horsepower. The motorcycle was used in races both as a solo and with a sidecar. In 1950, the engine was improved, and it was able to consistently deliver a maximum of 98 horsepower. The half-liter NSU could accelerate up to 240 kilometers per hour, From 1948 to 1950, inclusive, this machine was the champion of Germany. In the 1950s, NSU would make its technology famous with two records. In 1951, the Racing 500 with a supercharger was fitted with a fairing. The machine was named Dolphin 1, and on it, Wilhelm Hertz reached a top speed of 290 kilometers per hour on the track near Munich. It was a new world record. In 1956, the Dolphin 3 race car improved the result and broke Russell Wright's 1955 record on the Vincent. On the Bonneville Salt Flats, the supercharged NSU achieved a result of 338.99 kilometers per hour. At that time, the NSU power unit was tuned to 110 horsepower at 8,500 revolutions per minute. You might exclaim, "Crass moto, wait, what about mentions of Italian and British motorcycles with superchargers?" A little patience, friends. I decided to talk about German motorcycles in one segment. And now we'll take a look at designs from other countries. Italy is famous for its large motorcycle industry. By the early 30s, the idea of a supercharged motorcycle was already exciting designers from Italian brands. Everything happens according to the same principle mentioned at the story's beginning. Most likely at Moto Guzzi or Gilera, they were thinking the following: what? Only BMW is allowed to install a supercharger and win. Let's make our own. In 1931, Moto Guzzi was developing a supercharged four-cylinder 500cc bike for racing and records. But at a certain stage, the company's management considered the project too complicated and expensive. The first Italian company to present a supercharged production motorcycle would be Gilera. But the story of the base model Rondine didn't start at Gilera. At that time, the futuristic Transverse Inline 4 was developed in the mid-1920s by two Italian engineers, Carlo Giannini and Piero Rimor. They positioned the four-cylinder engine transversely across the motorcycle's axis to improve cooling. A couple of years later, the 500cc engine with a single overhead camshaft was ready. It produced about 28 horsepower. The motorcycle, released under the OPRA brand, debuted at the Milan exhibition in 1928. There were high hopes for it in racing, but both the machine and the riders were unlucky. Count Bonmartini, who financed the project, was also a racer and an aviator. In the early 30s, he founded the National Aeronautics Company. In 1933, he aimed to perfect the technology, realizing supercharging might be the best solution for its success. The engine was radically redesigned. The dimensions of the cylinder piston group were changed. The cylinder block was tilted forward by 45 degrees, making room for the compressor. A second camshaft appeared in the valve timing system. The engine received water cooling, and a Roots-type supercharger was installed. By the beginning of 1934, the car was ready for testing and received the name Randine from Graf, which translates as swallow. The Swallow made its debut at the Tripoli Grand Prix in 1935, and the drivers Taruffi and Rossetti took first and second place. The CNA Randine motorcycle was equipped with a fairing, but at the Italian Grand Prix, the Swallow was not so lucky. At best, 5th place. Although at the same time, Taruffi set a number of speed records. The best result was 244.62 kilometers per hour. At that time, Graf Bonmartini decided to retire and sold the CNA company to the aircraft manufacturer Caproni. Caproni wasn't interested in motorcycles and asked Taruffi to find a buyer. And that's when the Gilera company came along. They were interested in Randine, and they bought all 6 motorcycles and enlisted Taruffi's support. The motorcycle was thoroughly refined, and in 1937, it showed good results in the Grand Prix. And in October of 1937, the Gilera Randine briefly held the absolute speed record. On the A4 track, the motorcycle with Taruffi at the wheel reached a speed of 274.18 kilometers per hour. This record would last just over a month before being broken by Ernst Henne on a BMW. By 1939, the Gilera 500 was producing 92 horsepower at 8,000 revolutions per minute, which was an excellent figure. The war hindered Gilera's further compressor development. However, the Randine model would have a huge influence on the post-war machines of this brand. Moto Guzzi and Benelli first used compressors on single-cylinder engines, causing problems. Compressors provide constant pressure, but a single cylinder only draws in the mixture when the intake valve is open. During the other 3 strokes, intake pressure can dangerously increase. Therefore, a receiver had to be added between the compressor and the engine. These complications proved unjustified. In 1939, Moto Guzzi designers revisited supercharging, creating an inline 3-cylinder 500cc engine with dual overhead camshafts. Its estimated power was 80 horsepower. Above the gearbox, which had 5 speeds, a cassette vane supercharger was installed. The motorcycle was finished in 1940, but the war stopped it. Benelli was late as well. The motorcycles from this company performed well in races in the 30s, but in 38 and 39, they were pushed off the podium by the Supercharged DKWs. Giuseppe Benelli decided that in order to maintain superiority, he also needed to use supercharging. The racing Supercharged Benelli was ready in 39. The machine, featuring a 250cc overhead valve inline-4 and a root supercharger, produced 52 horsepower at 10,000 RPM. After tests conducted by Salvatore Baranciani on the Pesarofano Road, where he reached a speed of over 230 kilometers per hour, the miniature racing machine was presented at the Milan exhibition in December 39. The Supercharged Benelli was much more powerful than the Dampf Kraftwagen and seemed likely to surpass the Germans, but history had other plans. And now we've reached the foggy Albion. Do you think the engineers there just sat and watched the victories and records of BMW, Dampf Kraftwagen, and Galera? Of course not. Remember when I talked about the records of the BMW VR 750, I mentioned the British trio that competed with the Germans. It's time to talk about them. The British have long competed to see who has the fastest motorcycle. This competition included not just individual racers and engineers, but whole teams and companies. The focus was on motorcycles with large V-twin engines and minimal fairings. British record attempts took place at Brooklands, but it was far from an ideal track. Soon, a long and flat stretch of road was found in France, near the town of Arpajon. Later, this area would become known as the site of the Montlhéry Speed Cup. By 1929, naturally aspirated 1-liter J.A. Prestwich Phi twins had reached their power limit, with motorcycle speeds capped at about 200 to 210 kilometers per hour. The time had come to use supercharging. It's worth noting that the trio of Osborne Engineering Company Bro Superior and Zenith were very close-knit. Naturally, there was a competitive aspect among them, but often all these gentlemen worked together to bring prestige to their country. Meanwhile, major manufacturers such as Norton, Birmingham Small Arms, and Triumph generally avoided discussing speed races. In Britain, the motorcycle manufacturer Zenith was the most ardent supporter of speed records. During its heyday, from 1918 to 1930, they won more gold stars at Brooklands and set more world speed records than any other brand except BMW. Another Zenith motorcycle with a large J.A. Prestwich twin was ready by 1926. Its design improved yearly, peaking in 1930 when a supercharger was added. The potential of the 1-liter twin was about 80 horsepower at 6,000 revolutions per minute. In 1930 in Cork, Ireland, Joe Wright set an absolute world speed record, achieving a result of 242.5 kilometers per hour. However, the story of this record is associated with confusion and disorder. The International Motorcycle Federation's official register still lists the November 1930 record as set on an Osborne Engineering Company Temple J.A. Prestwich motorcycle. Joe Wright actually set the land speed record on an Osborne Engineering Company motorcycle on August 31, 1930 in Arpajon, France. But less than a month later, Ernst Henne on a BMW shows a better result. In response, the British were determined to break the record and were preparing for a run in Cork, Ireland in November. Despite the Osborne Engineering Company being ready, on that November day in 1930 in Cork, there were a couple of motorcycles present. The Osborne Engineering Company, prepared by specialist Claude Temple, with a backup Supercharged Zenith JAB in case of issues with the first motorcycle. That's exactly what happened. On November 6th, the Osborne Engineering Company broke down, and for several days Joe Wright had to switch to the Zenith and accelerate to the coveted 242.5 kilometers per hour. But the official record was set on the Osborne Engineering Company, which was declared as the motorcycle on which the record would be established. This happened perhaps also because by 1930 the Zenith Company was bankrupt and managed to survive until 1948 only, thanks to financial injections. And these stage shots for history were already taken with the Osborne Engineering Company motorcycle. In terms of the power unit, the motorcycles were identical. The Osborne Engineering Company stands out with its unique front wheel suspension. This system provided greater stability when riding in a straight line at high speed. That's how it is. So, what was the situation with Bro Superior? In 1930, the Bro Superior motorcycle with a supercharger emerged as another record-breaking version featuring the JA Prestwich twin engine. This beautiful motorcycle would compete for the title of the fastest until 1937. The racer, Eric Ferikoff, in 1936, on this motorcycle in Győr, Hungary, reached a speed of 263.64 kilometers per hour. The next year, Eric improved his record, reaching 273.25 kilometers per hour, and also set a speed record for motorcycles with a sidecar. But in November 1937, Ernst Henne from Germany set a new record. Eric Ferikoff returned to Hungary in November of the same year. He managed to accelerate his Bro Superior to about 270 kilometers per hour, just short of a new record, but he lost control and, together with the motorcycle, flew off the track. Eric was alive when brought to the university clinic, where he died without regaining consciousness. Another very interesting machine was this Zenith JAB, modified in 1931-1932 by Roberto Segrand at the Aros Kim plant. The JAB twin had a displacement of 1.7 liters, and the supercharger was located above the gearbox. The motorcycle was named Super Kim. Based on unconfirmed reports, Segrand held the South American speed record in the 1930s at about 250 kilometers per hour. In the 1930s, the 350cc Velocette and 500cc Norton dominated Isle of Man races. In 1937 and 1938, the British saw BMW and Dampfkraftwagen models outperform others in road races. For the proud inhabitants of the Misty Isle, this was unacceptable. And two companies, Velocette and A.J. Stevens and Ltd., nevertheless decided to create supercharged motorcycles. Let's start with A.J. Stevens and Ltd. In 1935, at the Olympia exhibition, Bert Collier debuted his 500cc overhead valve 4.4 engine and a road motorcycle featuring it. The machine never went into mass production, but by 1938, it had evolved from a civilian model into a racing one with a Zoller-designed supercharger. However, the engine overheated terribly, which required the use of liquid cooling. By 1939, the motorcycle was almost ready for racing. Its 500cc 50-degree 4.4 engine produced 55 horsepower. Two A.J. Stevens and Ltd. 4.4S competed in the 1939 Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, but only finished in 11th and 13th place due to frequent stops to refill the water cooling system. The V4 took part in the Ulster Grand Prix. It was the heaviest motorcycle in the race, 185 kilograms. But that didn't stop A.J. Stevens and Ltd. from setting a record average lap speed of over 160 kilometers per hour. However, afterward, the motorcycle would drop out of the race due to a fork failure. In 1946, A.J. Stevens and Ltd. 4.4 would make a couple more appearances in races, even winning one of them in Belgium. A.J. Stevens and Ltd. even began developing a new racing motorcycle with a horizontal inline supercharged twin. But in 46, it all came to an end. The second of these machines is the Velocette Roarer, created by Charles Udall from Veloce Limited. Charles designed an entirely new motorcycle and engine for it. At first glance, it's a parallel twin, but if you look at the engine diagram, it becomes clear that it's a paired unit. The two crankshafts of the roarer rotated in opposite directions, canceling out the reactive torque. Essentially, it was the British version of the all-conquering BMW flat twin, but with vertical cylinders and the defects of the Bavarian company corrected. The Velocette twin had a 500cc engine producing around 54 horsepower and could reach 225 kilometers per hour. Stanley Woods publicly tested the roarer at the 1939 Isle of Man Tourist Trophy races, even though both he and the factory knew that the motorcycle was not quite ready for racing. They also knew that war was inevitable, and the British team wanted to send a signal to their European rivals. We don't need funding from a fascist government to create the most technically advanced motorcycles in the world. The roarer made only one lap around the track. By the end of this chapter, a logical question emerges. Why doesn't the United States have any supercharged motorcycles? After all, the country is technically advanced, and the motorcycle manufacturers there are serious. By the 1920s, motorsport in the United States started developing independently and in isolation. Americans didn't go to Europe to race, and on their continent, they developed their own rules and their own races. As a result, the United States avoided the supercharged motorcycle race. At the chapter's end, another question emerges. When did the Superchargers' golden age end? This happened in the summer of 1946, when the International Motorcycling Federation decided to ban supercharging in road racing. The argument was simple. The use of superchargers led to too great a gap between racing machines and production models. Racing with superchargers persisted in Germany, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Germany joined the International Motorcycling Federation in 1951 and the Soviet Union in 1956. And around that time, work on supercharged motorcycles in these countries would be discontinued. If that event hadn't occurred in 1946, the modern motorcycle industry might be very different. Racing supercharged engines would likely have encouraged civilian vehicles to adopt this technology too. Following the last chapter, one might ask, what was the status of supercharged motorcycles in the Soviet Union? As is known, when it came to motorcycle manufacturing, the Soviet Union was among the countries that were catching up. The vast majority of equipment was based on the best foreign designs, many of which were German. After World War II, the victorious power not only acquired all the documentation from the Dampfkraftwagen factory, which ended up in its occupation zone, but also its specialists. In Chapao, German Democratic Republic, under Union of Soviet Socialist Republic supervision, 5 motorcycles were assembled in Design Bureau No. 10. Developed at Dampfkraftwagen, they featured a 2-stroke opposed piston engine. All these machines were sent to Serpukhov along with the documentation. These motorcycles, called GK1, which stands for Racing Compressor, participated in various all-union competitions until the late 40s. This engine was also installed in the record-setting Soviet car Zvezda 1. In the fall of '46, this lightweight race car reached a speed of 139.6 kilometers per hour over a distance of 1 kilometer. This result was recognized as the first post-war speed record in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1947, the Zvezda 2 race car debuted with higher engine power from increased boost pressure. The car set a speed record of 165.89 kilometers per hour. In Serpukhov, active work was underway on motorcycles built according to the Gorelli scheme with supercharging. This research also drew on the experience and advances of German engineers. In this all-union motorcycle design bureau near Moscow, in the second half of the 1940s, 3 models of supercharged racing motorcycles were created in some quantity. The S1B had a displacement of 125 cubic centimeters, 17 horsepower, and a top speed of 140 kilometers per hour. The S2B had a 250cc engine, 40 horsepower, and a 175 kN/h top speed. The S34 featured a 350cc engine, 55 horsepower, and a 200 km/h top speed. These motorcycles were mainly used for record-setting runs, not for road racing. Another interesting machine was a racing motorcycle developed at the Gorky Motor Plant. This was the GMZM 35. It was designed in 1947 by Naum Gudkin. The power unit, with a displacement of 339 cubic centimeters, produced a maximum of 22 horsepower. However, athletes managed to boost the engine up to 30 horsepower. The motorcycle was conceptually similar to a BMW, but its engine only resembled the German one. Gudkin did a tremendous job creating a small displacement boxer engine with a dry sump. In '49, a vane compressor was installed on the M35, and the motorcycle received the designation M35K. The engine power was increased to 44 horsepower. On the M35K, with a fairing and a sidecar, it was possible to reach a top speed of 191 kilometers per hour. At that time, it was a world record in the class up to 350 cubic centimeters with a sidecar. Another motorcycle with a supercharger was built in Verbiet based on the racing model M75. Here is one photograph of it that has been preserved. Another notable chapter in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is supercharged motorcycle history was the comets of Nikolai Shumilkin, whose record-breaking bikes date to the mid-1930s. It is claimed that Shumilkin was the first engineer in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to install a mechanical supercharger on a motorcycle. During the war, Nikolai Shumilkin helped manufacture aviation parts. Meanwhile, he researched BMW motorcycles, planning to resume his favorite work after the war. After the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' victory, Shumilkin began working on a new motorcycle, the BMW Kometa 2. As a base, he used the BMW R51, which was then one of the best motorcycles in the 500 cubic centimeters class. The engineer prepared new cylinders and valves, made pistons, and raised the compression ratio to 7. He used dry sump lubrication. Shumilkin equipped the Kometa 2 with a Zoller supercharger, driven by gears from the crankshaft. The 1946 version of the Kometa 2 boasted 41 horsepower. By 1951, the Soviet enthusiast managed to increase the engine's power to 55. Shumilkin set an absolute Union of Soviet Socialist Republics record for 1 kilometer at 204.89 kilometers per hour. A year later, Nikolai lowered the compression ratio and increased the boost pressure. The BMW 500 started producing 70 horsepower. That year, the record speed was 211.76 kilometers per hour. Then he tried his hand at riding a motorcycle with a sidecar. The record was 179.7 kilometers per hour. Around 1953, the designer from the Moscow Aviation Institute, Blinov, proposed the idea of a fairing. In 1954, the fairing was installed on a new motorcycle design. That's how the third Kometa began. The compressor pressure increased to 1.8 atmospheres. Methanol was used as fuel. The power reached about 90 horsepower. And here is the result. In 1954, a new all-union record was set on the Kometa 3 in the 500cc class for motorcycles with a sidecar, 198.019 kilometers per hour. And by the end of the year, the speed increased to 223.663 kilometers per hour. Nikolai Nikiforovich made his last run on the Kometa 3 in 1958 at the 69th kilometer of the Moscow-Minsk highway. During his career, the designer and at the same time racing enthusiast set about 100 all-union records. Soon, the legendary mechanic left motorsport due to his advanced age. In 1956, the Soviet Union joined the International Motorcycle Federation, and for 10 years, it had already been forbidden to use supercharged motorcycles in road racing there. And that's how the history of Soviet supercharged motorcycles came to an end. By the mid-20th century, supercharging on motorcycles was long forgotten. In racing, this technology became illegal. Superchargers lasted the longest in record-setting runs. NSU Dolphin 3, for example. Yet in the 1960s and 1970s, turbocharged designs already excelled in record setting. For civilian use, there was no point in adding forced induction to a motorcycle. It increased the cost and complexity of the design. Most importantly, even with a naturally aspirated engine, a motorcycle still delivered strong dynamic performance. In the 80s, there would be a brief period when motorcycle companies put their hopes in turbocharging. In particular, the Italians and the big Japanese motorcycle 4 would succeed in this area. However, this technology would not prove itself, and judging by the total number of motorcycles produced, it would be negligible. I talked about turbocharging in more detail in this segment. As I mentioned, superchargers have been banned in racing since 1946. However, the technology didn't disappear, and with the development of tuning culture closer to the end of the 20th century and in the following decades, there were quite a few vehicles where enthusiasts in workshops installed superchargers. Their motivations can vary, from wanting to have a motorcycle that's different from everyone else's, to being the boldest and fastest in the group. Enthusiasts have installed and continue to install superchargers on various types of motorcycles, starting with Harley-Davidson, Honda Goldwing, and different sport bikes from the Japanese Big Four, and even ending with small mopeds. This type of customization turned out to be big enough for companies and firms to be created that manufacture and sell ready-made supercharger kits for popular motorcycle models. The most well-known among these companies are Rotrex, ProCharger, and TTS Performance. This movement was especially notable in the United States with Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Just look at these beasts. But in the modern world, there is another remarkable supercharged motorcycle. And this is probably the first mass-produced supercharged motorcycle that is available for purchase, and most of its versions can be used on public roads. This is the Kawasaki H2R, as well as the H2 H2SX and the Naked Z H2. The Kawasaki H2R story began in the 2010s with reports of serious development starting in 2013, while the ZZR 1400 sport touring model was expected to be redesigned. Kawasaki chose a different direction. In September 2014, a completely new model, the H2R with a supercharger, was announced. A year later, the motorcycle was presented to the public. The H2R was created due to a long-running competition among mainly Japanese motorcycle makers to build the fastest, most powerful bike by Kawasaki. This company doesn't just produce motorcycles, ATVs, and jet skis. Over its 138-year history, Kawasaki Heavy Industries has worked in many areas, including railroad locomotives, ships and submarines, infrastructure projects, military aviation, and engine building. After listing all this, is it even necessary to mention the corporation has long mastered advanced materials and technologies? The Kawasaki Ninja H2R model is equipped with a 1-liter inline 4-cylinder, 16-valve engine with a centrifugal supercharger. On the early versions of the motorcycle, the engine managed to produce a maximum of 310 horsepower and 165 newton meters of torque. But later the power was increased a bit more to 326 horsepower. The centrifugal dynamic supercharger was chosen for a reason. First, it provides constant boost pressure, not in bursts, which is optimal for an inline 4. Second, this type of supercharger heats the incoming air the least. This fact allowed HDVAR to do without an intercooler. The supercharger impeller is driven mechanically. With a planetary gear, the crankshaft spins at 14,000 revolutions per minute, while the impeller reaches 130,000 revolutions per minute. Kawasaki HDVAR became the world's first motorcycle with a 1-liter engine that managed to produce more than 300 horsepower. This is a huge prestige for the company. Along with a powerful engine, Kawasaki designed an exceptional chassis and a distinctive aerodynamic body kit with winglets and other features. The company's extensive experience in aircraft manufacturing is evident. Back in 2014, the motorcycle was tested in a wind tunnel. Its body kit proved effective at speeds of up to about 700 kilometers per hour. The H2R has incredible potential. It accelerates from 0 to 100 in less than 2.5 seconds. The top speed is 400 kilometers per hour. In 2016, racer Kenan Sofuoglu, a 5-time Superbike champion, hit 400 kilometers per hour on Istanbul's Osman Ghazi Bridge. At the same time, he accelerated from 0 to top speed in just 26 seconds. A year earlier, James Hiller completed a lap on the Isle of Man circuit. It was a demonstration run outside of the competition. The motorcycle excelled in the race, setting a speed record of 332 kilometers per hour on the Isle of Man. The civilian version of the H2 with a power output of 220 horsepower, and since 2019, 228, also holds a number of records. In the quarter-mile run, the H2 showed a result of 9.62 seconds. The exit speed was 244.64 kilometers per hour. The top speed record for a stock H2 is 337.06 kilometers per hour. And after a slight tune-up at the Mojave Magnum land speed races, Kent Kunitsugu achieved a result of 365.2 kilometers per hour. The H2R was long desired by many. Wannabe racers hurriedly tore down their Yamaha R1 and BMW S1000 race replica posters from their rooms and rushed to the newsstands for Kawasaki posters. One of the latest versions of the supercharged Kawasaki family was the Naked ZH2 model in 2019. Its specs are similar to the H2SX, but the Z's equipment is much more budget-friendly. The Supercharged Naked uses simpler suspension and braking components. It also lacks a number of electronic assistants. As of today, the Kawasaki Supercharged motorcycle family is the top in performance and excitement per 1 liter of engine displacement. A natural question is, what about the other manufacturers? Have they truly accepted Kawasaki's superiority? I don't think so, and work on supercharged motorcycles is probably already underway. From the latest news I've come across, there's the Honda Africa Twin 1100 with a supercharger. This news popped up at the end of 2023. It's known that Honda has patented a supercharging system that's located above the gearbox. However, the timing of the Africa model, with the supercharger's public debut, remains undisclosed, and it's unclear if it will be presented at all. Why did Honda decide to increase the power of their Tour Enduro? I have a theory that this is due to the general trend of increasing engine displacement and power in large adventure motorcycles. If 10 or 15 years ago in this class, 1,000 to 1,200 cc and 90 to 120 horsepower were the average figures, today the average power has increased to 140 horsepower. Engine sizes have increased. The GS is now 1.3 liters. Time will tell which new supercharged motorcycles are built, and we'll be watching closely. However, this class of machines won't become particularly widespread. A supercharger is high-tech and expensive, and higher prices don't promise high sales. For the most part, motorcycles with internal combustion engines will remain naturally aspirated. Friends, this episode is ending. In this rather extensive material, I tried to thoroughly cover the history and specific models of motorcycles with mechanical supercharging. This is a story of races, records, remarkable speeds, and innovative engineering. It tells of the battle for prestige and titles among motorcycle makers, engineers, designers, and even nations, as well as a number of events that influence this industry. I hope that this story turned out to be interesting and informative. If that's really the case, then the best thing you can do to promote this video is to share it with good acquaintances and friends who are interested in motorcycles and technology. A comment and subscription, if you haven't already, would help. Active engagement on the channel motivates me to keep gathering facts and creating informative explorations of motorcycle engineering history. I would like to especially thank everyone who supports my channel financially using the details provided in the description. This was Crasmoto Channel. See you next time.